The first thing Nate noticed when he stepped off the ramp was the size of everything. Not just the people, everything. The landing platform was made of dark stone, and it stretched out in both directions, further than a football field. The gates at the far end were carved from something that looked like black iron, and they stood at least 40 feet high. The carvings on them were deep and detailed, battle scenes by the look of them, figures locked together in combat, weapons raised, bodies in motion. Even the carvings were larger than Nate. He stood at the bottom of the ramp with his bag over one shoulder and took it all in. Then Zarveth walked through the gate. Nate had not seen the alien since the day of the dropship. In the field, Zarveth had been wearing standard military gear, covered in ash and blood, and the particular look of a person who had just come very close to dying. Now he was in full ceremonial dress, dark layered robes, over a fitted warplate frame, the fabric deep blue with silver edging that caught the light when he moved. He was nearly 10 feet tall and walked like someone who had been told his whole life that the ground was lucky to have him on it, and had come to believe it in the most natural and easy way possible. He stopped in front of Nate and looked down at him. Then he brought both hands forward and wrapped them around Nate's forearm, the full Kethon warrior's clasp, firm and deliberate, the kind that meant something. Nate gripped back the same way, which he had read about on page 44 of the briefing, and which he was glad he remembered. Zarveth said, in accented but clear English, that he was glad Nate had come. He said it simply and without extra words, the way soldiers talk when they mean what they say. Nate said he was glad to be there. Zarveth turned and walked beside him toward the gate. As they passed through it, the world on the other side opened up, and Nate stopped walking for just a moment, because the view demanded it. The wedding complex was not a building. It was a series of connected structures spread across a landscape the size of a small city, set against the dark green hills of Varathos. Towers rose at intervals, each one a different height, connected by long covered walkways. Courtyards opened between them, and in each courtyard there were gathered groups of alien guests, nobles and warlords, and high-ranking officials from across the empire and beyond it. They were dressed in elaborate ceremonial wear, in every color Nate could name, and several he could not. They were large, all of them. The smallest guest he could see was still a head taller than him. Most were considerably more than that. And they were all, at various moments, looking at him. Not staring, not pointing, just noticing. The way people notice something that does not quite fit the pattern of everything else around it. Nate kept his face easy and his posture straight. His mother, Carol Holloway, had told him once that the way you walk into a room tells people what you think of yourself before you ever open your mouth. He walked like he was supposed to be there, because as far as the invitation was concerned, he was. Zarveth led him through the outer courtyard and into the welcome hall, which was the size of an aircraft hangar and lit from above by long vertical windows that let in the greenish light of the Kethon sky. The floor was polished stone. The ceiling was carved with the same battle imagery as the gates outside. At the far end of the hall, a long ceremonial table was being prepared by attendants who moved quickly and quietly and paid no attention to the guests gathering around them. Zarveth began introducing Nate to the people nearest the entrance. The introductions were brief and formal. Most of the aliens responded with a nod or a short phrase that Nate's earpiece translator handled smoothly enough. A few looked at him with open curiosity. One, a broad-scaled noble from what Zarveth called the Eastern Vassalry, crouched down slightly to look Nate in the face more directly, examined him for a moment, and then said something that the translator rendered as, "smaller than expected, but the eyes are steady." Nate took that as a compliment. Then Zarveth introduced him to the group gathered near the central pillar, and that was where things changed. The being standing at the center of that group was Lord Drakos. Even among the Kethan, Drakos was large. He stood close to 11 feet, broad across the chest and shoulders in a way that suggested not just size, but weight, the kind of solid mass that had been built by generations of selection for exactly one purpose. His ceremonial armor was dark red, edged in gold. Nate registered the red before he remembered that red at a Kethan wedding was a deliberate statement, not a mistake. It meant the wearer considered the event a test rather than a celebration. Drakos was the bride's uncle, second-tier noble of the Kethan military hierarchy. And by the way, every other guest in his immediate area was standing slightly back from him. He was someone whose opinion of a room tended to become the room's opinion of itself. He looked at Nate the way a man looks at something left on his doorstep that he did not order. Then he spoke. His voice was low and carried across the hall without effort. The translator took a moment, and then gave Nate the words, "What is a soft-skinned groundling doing standing among the honored?" The hall did not go silent all at once. It went quiet in a wave, group by group, as the question reached outward from Drakos across the room. Within a few seconds, the only sounds were the distant movements of the table attendants at the far end. Everyone was watching. Zarveth beside Nate had gone very still. Nate did not look at Zarveth. He kept his eyes on Drakos and let the silence sit for just a beat, long enough to show he was not flustered, short enough to show he was not stalling. Then he said the 6 words in Kethan that he had memorized from page 31 of the cultural briefing, the formal phrase for a warrior responding to a challenge of presence. "I am here at the warrior's call." The pronunciation was not perfect, but it was close enough to be understood. Drakos looked at him for a long moment. His expression did not change. But something shifted in the quality of his attention, the way a person shifts when they hear something they were not expecting to hear. Around the hall, the quiet stretched a moment longer. Then conversation began again, low and scattered at first, and then more normal, and the wave of attention moved on. Zarveth exhaled beside him. He said quietly and in English, "That was the correct phrase." Nate said he had read it a few times to make sure. Zarveth looked at him sideways. He said "a few times" in the tone of someone who suspected the real number was higher and appreciated the effort behind it. Nate picked up a small glass of something blue from a passing attendant's tray and looked out across the hall at the gathered empire around him. Hundreds of beings from dozens of worlds, every one of them larger and older in history than anything he came from. Drakos had moved back to his group, but had not stopped watching. Nate drank the blue thing. It tasted like cold copper and something floral. It was not bad. He stood straight and kept his eyes easy, and waited to see what would happen next. The welcome feast had not yet started when the horn sounded. It was a low, long note that came from somewhere near the ceiling, and filled the hall the way thunder fills an open field. Not loud exactly, but present in a way that made the air feel different. Nate had read about the horn in the briefing. It meant a formal challenge was being called. It meant whatever was about to happen was going to happen in front of everyone, and would be remembered. He had read that part more than once. Every head in the hall turned toward the center of the floor. The attendants moved quietly to the edges. The guests spread back without being asked, creating a wide-open circle of polished stone in the middle of the room. At the far edge of that circle, Lord Drakos stepped forward. He was looking at Nate. Zarveth moved close and spoke low and fast. He said this was the trial of the floor. He said any warrior guest could be called to defend their right to stand in the hall. He said the rules were simple. First, to be put to the ground, no killing strikes, yield or be yielded. He said the weapons would be Kethan short blades, which were provided by the house. He said Nate did not have to accept. Nate asked what happened if he did not accept. Zarveth was quiet for a moment. Then he said that declining a trial of the floor was not forbidden, but that it meant the person who declined had no further standing in the hall. They could stay as a non-warrior guest, a spectator essentially. They would not be considered honored. The warrior's bond that Zarveth had extended would not be broken, but it would be reduced in the eyes of everyone present. It would mean Dracos had been right about what he said at the pillar. Nate thought about that for about 3 seconds. Then he handed his glass to Zarveth and walked toward the circle. A sound moved through the hall as he did. Not quite a murmur, something quieter than that. The sound of several hundred beings recalibrating what they thought they were about to see. At the edge of the circle, an attendant was waiting, with 2 short blades laid across a long, flat case. Nate picked one up and turned it over in his hands. It was heavy at the back end, near the base of the handle, and the blade curved outward slightly from the midpoint. It was built for someone with a much longer arm span than his, designed to be swung in wide arcs that used body weight and reach to drive force. In the hands of a Kethan warrior, it would be a fluid and powerful weapon. In Nate's hands, the balance was wrong. He gripped it at a slightly higher point on the handle to shift the weight forward. Not ideal, but better. Dracos took the other blade without looking at it. He held it the way a person holds something they have held 10,000 times before. He stepped to the center of the circle and stood there and waited, and he did not look like someone preparing to fight. He looked like someone preparing to finish something. Nate stepped into the circle. The hall was completely quiet. Dracos moved first, and he moved the way large, powerful beings always moved when they were completely certain of the outcome. Directly forward, no angle, no misdirection, just the full weight of his advantage coming straight ahead. The blade came in a wide, sweeping arc from his right side. Exactly the kind of strike the weapon was designed for. The kind that used reach and mass together, and left very little room to simply dodge out of the way. Nate did not dodge out of the way. He stepped into it. Inside the arc, the strike lost its power. The wide swing needed distance to build force, and Nate had taken the distance away. He was inside Dracos' guard now, where the alien size was a disadvantage rather than an advantage, where the long limbs had no room to work. Nate had spent 4 years learning how to fight in tight spaces, in corridors and wreckage, and places where you could not move your arms properly. He knew what it felt like to be the smaller person in a small space. He knew how to use it. His blade came up short and tight, not a wide swing, but a controlled push, pressing flat against Dracos' forearm and leveraging it outward. At the same time, he put his left shoulder into the alien's center of mass at a downward angle, not trying to knock him over, but trying to break the balance, to interrupt the automatic recovery that every trained fighter relied on after a missed strike. Dracos was strong, and his recovery was fast. But for 1/2 second, his weight was going one direction, and his feet were going another. Nate was already moving to his left. The second exchange was faster than the first. Dracos adjusted, came at him lower and tighter, less committed to the wide arc now, and more careful. He was not panicking. He was a trained warrior, and he was adapting. That was the honest truth of it. If the fight had gone on much longer, the gap in size and strength would have started to tell. But Nate had been watching the way Dracos shifted his weight during the first attack. He had noticed that the alien carried more weight on his right side when he set up a forward press. It was a small habit, the kind that came from years of fighting opponents who were roughly the same size and build, where it did not matter, because no one else was small enough or low enough to use it. On the third exchange, Nate went low. He dropped under the incoming blade, stepped inside again, drove his left shoulder hard into the outside of Dracos' right knee. Not a breaking strike, a leveraging one, and used the alien's own forward momentum to redirect where that weight was going. Dracos went sideways and down, one knee hitting the stone floor with a sound that echoed across the hall. Nate had the blade tip at his throat before the echo finished. The silence in the hall lasted for a long moment. Then Nate lowered the blade and stepped back and extended his right hand. It was a human gesture. Dracos had almost certainly never seen it before. But a hand extended after a fight, open and forward, was plain enough in its meaning across most species that did things with hands. It meant the fight was over. It meant no bad feeling was being carried forward from it. Dracos looked at the hand. Then he looked at Nate's face. Whatever he was reading there, he looked at it for a few seconds before he reached out and gripped the hand and let Nate pull him to his feet. The hall did not cheer. The Kethon did not cheer at things like this. What they did was something slower and more deliberate. Around the circle, one by one, and then in groups, the guests brought their right hands to their left shoulders and held them there. Zarveth, from the edge of the circle, was doing it too. The translator in Nate's ear offered the cultural note quietly. The gesture was called the Mark of the Witnessed. It was given when something had been seen that deserved to be remembered. Nate stood in the center of the floor and let it happen. Dracos said nothing. He turned and walked back to his group. But before he did, he gave Nate one short look. Not warm exactly, not friendly, but different from the look at the pillar. Less certain of something it had been certain of before. Nate picked up the short blade case from where the attendant was holding it, set the weapon back carefully, and walked back to where Zarveth was standing. Zarveth handed him his blue drink back. Nate finished it. It still tasted like copper and flowers. He still thought it was not bad. The welcome feast began shortly after. The wedding of High Noble Zarveth to Lady Esaketh lasted 3 days. Nate stayed for all of it. He ate food he could not identify, stood through ceremonies he only partly understood, and navigated 7 different social situations in which he was the only human in the room and everyone else was substantially larger than him. He handled all of it the same way he handled most things, by paying attention, by being polite, and by not making any assumptions about what the next moment was going to bring. On the second day, 3 separate nobles came to speak to him directly. They did not challenge him. They asked him questions. They wanted to know about his training, about the human military, about the fight with Dracos. Nate answered simply and without inflating anything. He said what was true. 2 of the nobles listened without comment and then gave him the shoulder gesture before they left. The third, an older warrior noble with faded markings along his jaw, told Nate that in 40 years of attending these events, he had seen the trial of the floor called 30 times. He had never seen anyone go inside the Ark before. Nate said it was the only space available. The noble looked at him for a moment and then made a sound that the translator called a laugh, though it was lower and shorter than any laugh Nate had ever heard. On the 3rd day, the actual marriage ceremony took place. It was long and formal and conducted in Old Kethan that even the translator had some trouble with. Zarveth and Esaketh stood at the center of the hall, in full ceremonial dress, and made their declarations in front of every guest present. Esaketh was tall even by Kethan standards, with the composed and direct bearing of someone who had been raised in a household where calm was considered more valuable than noise. She had spoken to Nate briefly on the first evening. Just a few words of formal thanks for what he had done for Zarveth. And her manner had been precise and genuine at the same time. Nate thought they matched well. He was not an expert on Kethan marriages, but he thought that was probably the part that mattered. At the end of the ceremony, when the final declarations had been made and the witnessing guests had completed their ritual responses, Zarveth looked across the hall at Nate and gave him a nod. It was a small gesture, and a human one. Zarveth had spent enough time near the human military to have picked it up somewhere. But it carried the weight of what it was meant to carry. Nate nodded back. He flew home the next morning. For the first week, nothing happened. Nate returned to base, returned to his unit, and returned to the ordinary rhythm of a forward posting, drills and maintenance, and the particular low-level boredom that sat between deployments like water sitting between rocks. Calvin Drew asked him how the wedding was. Nate said it was interesting. Calvin asked if that was a good interesting or a bad interesting. Nate thought about the trial of the floor, and the blue drink, and the old noble with the laugh. He said it was mostly good. Calvin seemed satisfied with that. On the 9th day after his return, Colonel Pierce called him in again. She was standing this time, which she did not usually do. She had a document in her hand, printed on a grade of paper Nate did not recognize, heavy and faintly textured, with a deep embossed seal at the top that he recognized from the cultural briefing. It was the imperial crest of the Kethan Empire. Not the military seal, not the noble house seal, the imperial crest, the one that appeared on documents that came directly from the throne. Pierce set the document on the desk and looked at him. She said a formal courier vessel had arrived at the border checkpoint that morning. She said it was carrying exactly one item. She held up the document. She told him what it said. The Kethan Emperor, Vorsath IV, was invoking an ancient tradition called the open floor naming. It had not been used in over 300 years. It allowed the emperor to formally designate an individual of demonstrated varoshi, a quality that translated roughly as strength that does not need to prove itself, as the champion of the open floor. The champion served as the empire's representative in formal disputes, ceremonial challenges, and high-stakes trials that required a neutral party of proven and witnessed honor. The champion carried the emperor's voice in those matters. Their decisions were recognized across every vassal world in the empire. The last person to hold the title had been a Kethan general, who served for 60 years and whose decisions shaped the Outer Rim's political boundaries for 3 centuries after his death. The emperor was offering the title to Corporal Nate Holloway, 29 years old, Forward Base Callaway, Columbus, Ohio. Pierce read the document aloud to the end. Then she set it down. Then she looked at him with the expression she used when she was trying to work out whether a situation was an opportunity or a problem, and had not yet decided. She said, "You read 60 pages. Nate did not confirm or deny the exact number. She was quiet for a moment, and in that quiet, Nate could hear the base going about its day outside the office window, the distant sound of a drill unit running formations, the hum of the maintenance bays, all the ordinary noise of a place that did not yet know that the morning had changed. She told him that accepting the title would require a return to Varethos for a formal acceptance ceremony. It would require him to be available for imperial appointments, not constantly, but at the emperor's call. It would require a renegotiation of his status within the human military to account for his new role within the empire. She said there would be people further up the chain who would need to review the offer and make decisions about it. Then she told him, with the bluntness she always used when she thought the direct thing was the most useful thing, that none of those decisions were going to be no. A human holding a formal imperial title within the Kethan Empire was the kind of thing that shifted diplomatic relationships in ways that took generations to fully understand. The political value of it was not small. She said the people further up the chain were going to understand that very clearly. Nate looked at the document on the desk, at the seal, at the careful formal script of the translation running underneath the original Kethan text. He thought about Dracos asking what a soft-skinned groundling was doing, standing among the honored. He thought about going inside the ark. He thought about the old noble's laugh, and the shoulder gesture moving across the hall, and the small nod from Zarveth at the end of the ceremony. He had not done any of it to become anything. He had pulled a man out of a burning ship because the man needed pulling. He had stepped into the circle because stepping out would have meant something he did not want to mean. He had extended his hand afterward because that was what you did when a fight was finished and no bad feeling needed to be carried forward from it. And now, a 4,000-year-old empire was sending him documents with the imperial seal on them. He looked at Pierce. She said, "Well?" Nate picked up the document and read it again from the top, carefully this time. Then he set it back down and said he thought he should accept. Pierce said she thought so too. Outside the window, the drill unit was still running formations. The maintenance bays were still humming. The base was still going about its ordinary day. It did not yet know that one of its corporals had just become something the Empire had not named in 300 years. The second time Nate flew to Var Ethos, he had read the entire cultural briefing, all 412 pages. He had done it over 6 evenings at the base, sitting at the small desk in his bunk room with a cup of coffee going cold beside him. Calvin had come in on the third evening, seen the stack of printed pages, and asked no questions. He had simply made Nate a second cup of coffee and left it on the edge of the desk. That was the kind of person Calvin was. Nate arrived at the Kethan homeworld on a gray morning, the sky the deep green-gray color it turned when the larger of the two moons was rising. He was met at the platform by a formal escort, 4 Imperial guards in full ceremonial plate, their armor black with gold edging, and the Imperial crest engraved at the center of each chestpiece. They were tall and quiet, and moved with the synchronized precision of beings who had been doing this for a very long time. They led him through a part of the complex he had not seen at the wedding. The path took them away from the celebration halls and toward the older section of the grounds, where the structures were lower and plainer and built from a darker stone. This was the original Imperial Quarter, the briefing had told him, the part that had been here when the rest of the complex was still open ground. The carvings on these walls were not battle scenes. They were records, long lines of script running from ground level to the tops of the walls, names and dates and formal declarations, the kind of thing a civilization writes down when it wants something to last longer than the people who were there for it. Nate read a few lines as he passed. The translator in his ear worked slowly through the old dialect and gave him fragments. Witnessed and recorded. Carried forward. The acceptance hall was at the center of the old quarter. It was not large. After the wedding hall, it felt almost small, maybe the size of a school gymnasium, with a ceiling that was lower than everything else on the grounds, and a floor of the same dark polished stone. There were no decorations, no banners, no ceremonial tables, just the floor and the walls, and the light coming in through narrow vertical windows, and at the far end of the room, a single raised platform with 2 figures standing on it. One was a court official in deep blue robes, carrying a long flat case. The other was the emperor. Vorsaf IV was old, not ancient-looking in the way some of the oldest Kethan nobles looked, where age had become something visible and weighty. His age showed differently, in the careful way he held himself, in the economy of his movements, in the quality of his stillness. He did not have the mass of Dracos, or the commanding physical presence of the warrior nobles. He was still tall by human standards, still broad in the way all Kethan were broad. But what came off him was not size. It was something quieter and harder to put a name to. He looked at Nate, the way Nate's grandfather, a retired Marine named Lou Holloway, used to look at the young soldiers who came through his VFW post on Memorial weekends. Not testing them, not judging them, just reading something about them that had nothing to do with rank or age or size. Nate stopped at the center of the floor. The court official began to speak. Old Kethan, formal and measured. The translator worked steadily but not perfectly, giving Nate the sense of what was being said rather than every exact word. The declaration of the open floor naming, the lineage of the title, the 300 years it had sat unclaimed, the criteria for its invocation, Varoshi, witnessed and recognized, certified by the presence of the imperial record. The official spoke for a long time. Nate stood straight and listened. Outside, the gray-green morning was brightening slightly as the moon finished its rise. When the declaration was complete, the Emperor stepped down from the platform. He walked across the floor to where Nate was standing and stopped a few feet away. Up close, his eyes were the deep amber color common to older Chthon, and they were steady in the way that things are steady when they have been steady for a very long time. He reached into the flat case the official held open and took out a narrow band of dark metal. It was plain and undecorated, which Nate had read about. The champion's mark was deliberately simple because it did not need to announce itself. Everyone who recognized it already knew what it meant. The Emperor placed it around Nate's right wrist. The metal was cool and fitted exactly, and Nate did not ask how they had his measurements. They were an empire 4,000 years old. They had probably sorted out the measuring part. Then the Emperor spoke. 12 words in Old Chthon, slow and deliberate. The translator took a moment and then gave them quietly. You are recognized. The Empire sees what you carry. Carry it well. The hall was silent. Nate thought about the burning dropship. He thought about the smoke and the heat and the panel that had been across Zarveth's legs, and the weight of the alien across his shoulders, over 100 meters of open ground. He thought about the circle in the wedding hall and going inside the ark, and the moment when Drakos went down, and the choice to extend a hand afterward. He thought about Pierce at her desk, reading a document with an imperial seal on it, and Calvin leaving a second cup of coffee on the edge of a desk without asking any questions, and his mother telling him that the way you walk into a room tells people what you think of yourself before you ever open your mouth. None of it had been about becoming anything. It had just been about doing the thing that was in front of him to do, in the way it needed doing. And now a 4,000-year-old empire had put a piece of metal on his wrist and given him a title that had not existed for 3 centuries. He looked at the Emperor. Then he said in plain English that the translator would carry to everyone in the hall, I'll do my best, sir. The Emperor held his gaze for a moment. Whatever he was reading in it, he seemed satisfied with what he found. He gave Nate a single nod and then turned and walked back toward the platform, with the same careful and unhurried movement he had arrived with. From near the back wall, where a small group of court witnesses had been standing quietly through the whole ceremony, came a sound. Low, short, deliberate. Nate's translator identified it a half-second later. Approval. He turned slightly to see who had made it. Lord Drakos was standing at the edge of the witness group. His arms were crossed, and his expression was the same difficult, unreadable expression it usually was. But he had made the sound, and he was still looking at Nate with the look he had given him at the end of the fight, the one that was different from the look at the pillar, less certain of something it had been certain of before, something that had not quite decided yet what it wanted to become, but was no longer what it used to be. Nate held his gaze for a moment. Then he brought his right hand to his left shoulder and held it there. The mark of the witnessed, given when something had been seen that deserved to be remembered. He held it for 3 seconds. Then he lowered his hand. Drakos looked at him for another moment. Then he looked away, back toward the platform, in the manner of someone who was done with a thing and was moving on to the next one. Which was, Nate had come to understand, probably the closest Drakos got to warmth. The court official closed the flat case. The witnesses began to move toward the exit. Outside the narrow windows, the morning had gone from gray to the steady deep green of a clear Chthon day, and the light fell across the old stone floor in long, flat angles. Nate stood at the center of the acceptance hall, with a plain band of dark metal on his wrist, and the title of Champion of the Open Floor, the first in 300 years, recognized across every world in the Empire. He was 29 years old. He was from Columbus, Ohio. He had read all 412 pages. He straightened his uniform, picked up his bag from where the escort had set it by the door, and walked out into the Chthon morning to see what came next. The invitation came on a Tuesday. Nate Holloway was sitting in the break room of Forward Base Callaway, eating cold noodles from a tin and staring at nothing in particular, when his comm unit beeped. He picked it up without thinking, expecting orders or maybe a message from his sister back in Columbus. Instead, the screen showed a long block of alien text, with a small translation bar running underneath it. He read it twice. Then he put down his noodles. The message was from Zarveth, a Kethan officer Nate had pulled out of a burning dropship 6 months ago during the last days of the Sigma Reach ceasefire. Nate had not thought much about that day since. He had done what needed doing. The ship was on fire, Zarveth was trapped under a collapsed panel, and Nate had been the closest person with working hands. He dragged the alien out, carried him across 100 meters of open ground, and handed him to the medics. Then he went back to his unit and ate cold noodles because that was what was available. Apparently, Zarveth had thought about that day quite a bit. The message said that Zarveth was getting married. It said the ceremony would be held on the Kethan homeworld of Varethos in 3 weeks. It said that Nate was being formally invited as an honored guest under the Warrior's Bond, a tradition that meant the person who had saved your life was owed a seat at every important table you ever set for the rest of your days. At the bottom of the message, there was a small glowing seal, a reply button. The translation bar said, "Press to accept, press to decline." Nate meant to press decline. He pressed accept. He stared at the screen for a long moment after that, in the quiet way a man stares at something he cannot undo. Then he picked up his noodles and finished eating, because there was nothing else to do about it right then. The next morning, Colonel Dana Pierce called him into her office. Pierce was the kind of officer who did not raise her voice, because she never needed to. She was in her early 50s, with short gray hair, and eyes that always looked like they were adding something up. Her office was clean and organized, and had no personal items in it, except for a single photograph on the corner of her desk that Nate had never been close enough to make out. She was sitting behind that desk when Nate walked in, and she had a printed copy of his acceptance confirmation in her hand. She looked at him for a moment before she said anything. Then she said, "Do you know what you just accepted?" Nate said he had a general idea. Pierce set the paper down and folded her hands on top of it. She told him, in plain and careful words, that a Kethan noble wedding was not the kind of event a person just attended. The Kethan Empire was one of the oldest civilizations in the known systems. They had been building cities when humans were still sharpening rocks. Their culture was layered with tradition and protocol and ritual in a way that most alien diplomats spent years trying to understand. A wedding among the Kethan nobility was a political event as much as a personal one. Every guest at that table carried a meaning. Every action taken in that hall was watched and noted. She told him that because he had accepted under the Warrior's Bond, he could not decline now without creating a diplomatic problem between the Empire and the human military. The Kethan took bond invitations seriously. Turning one down after acceptance was considered an insult to the host's honor. Nate said he understood. Pierce opened her desk drawer and placed a data chip on the table. She said it contained the full cultural briefing for Kethan formal events. She said it was 412 pages long. She told him to read all of it before he arrived. Then she told him he had 3 days before his transport left. Nate picked up the chip and said thank you. Pierce looked at him the way she always looked at soldiers when she was trying to decide whether they were capable or just lucky. She did not say which one she thought he was. She told him to go pack, and to, for the love of everything, press nothing else without reading it first. He packed that evening. His gear was simple: dress uniform, personal kit, the data chip. His bunkmate, a lanky medic named Calvin Drew, watched him fold his uniform and asked where he was going. Calvin put down the book he was reading and stared. Then Calvin said, "The alien wedding." Nate said, "Yes." Calvin said, "On their planet." Nate said, "Yes." Calvin thought about that for a moment, and then said, "That sounded like either the best or worst thing that had ever happened to anyone, and he genuinely could not tell which." Nate could not tell either. He sat on the transport ship for 11 hours. He read 60 pages of the cultural briefing before his eyes started to blur. He learned that the Kethan greeting bow meant different things depending on the angle. He learned that their color red was used only at funerals and should not appear on any clothing at a wedding. He checked his dress uniform 3 times to make sure there was no red on it anywhere. There was not. He also learned that speaking directly to a first-tier noble without being spoken to first was considered an open challenge to their authority. He underlined that one. At the 61st page, he fell asleep. The transport docked at the Outer Rim relay station by late afternoon. From there, a smaller Kethan vessel was waiting to carry him the rest of the way. The crew of that vessel were polite and quiet and very large. The smallest one among them stood nearly 8 feet tall and moved through the narrow corridor with the ease of something that had never once worried about fitting through a doorway. Nate sat in the passenger hold and looked out the small round window at the stars. He thought about the burning dropship. He thought about the heat and the noise and the weight of Zarveth across his shoulders. He had not been thinking about honor that day, or about tradition, or about warrior bonds. He had been thinking about the fact that there was a living creature trapped under a panel, and he had 2 working hands, and that was really the whole of the calculation. He had not expected any of this to follow from that. The Kethan homeworld came into view through the window about 2 hours later. It was large and dark green and covered in what looked like enormous structures that glittered even from orbit. Nate pressed his face a little closer to the glass. He had 40 pages left of the briefing he had not read. He thought about reading them. Then the vessel began its descent, and the window filled with light, and the ground came up fast, and he figured he would just have to manage with what he knew. He straightened his uniform, picked up his bag, and walked toward the exit ramp. Below him, a planet 4,000 years older than anything his people had ever built was waiting. Nate Holloway took a breath and stepped off the ramp.